Behind heavy, dark wooden doors, deep within the Vatican's subterranean vaults, lies one of the most enigmatic collections of documents in human history, the secret archive of the Inquisition. 85 kilometers of shelves filled with yellowed manuscripts, interrogation protocols, and court records. For centuries, these papers remained silent, guarding the secrets of one of Europe's darkest institutions. Only in 1998 did the Vatican lift the veil of secrecy, granting a limited circle of researchers access to these materials. To gain entry, a scholar requires special permission signed by the Cardinal Archivist. Each day, no more than 60 chosen individuals can descend into the cool halls, where temperature and humidity are maintained at levels essential for the preservation of ancient documents. Here, among thousands of volumes, lie testimonies concerning the fates of over 70,000 people who passed through the Inquisition's tribunals. Each folder is not merely an archival file. It is a story of a broken life, a history of fear, and the struggle of the human spirit against a system that tolerated no dissent. The Inquisition did not arise overnight. It was born of fear. The Church's fear of the spread of heresies, which in the 13th century began to multiply throughout Europe like mushrooms after rain. Cathars in southern France, Waldensians in the Alps, Beguines in the German lands, these movements questioned the authority of the Roman Church and offered an alternative interpretation of Christianity. Pope Gregory IX, seeing this as an existential threat to Catholicism, established a special tribunal in 1231, designed to eradicate heresies. Initially, the Inquisition consisted of itinerant Dominican monks who arrived in a city, announced their presence, and offered a period of grace. Anyone could come, repent of their heretical views, and receive a light punishment. But over time, the methods became increasingly sophisticated and cruel. While in the first decades the inquisitors genuinely sought to return the lost sheep to the fold of the Church, by the end of the 13th century, their activity had turned into a veritable machine of suppression. The structure of the inquisitorial court was meticulously thought out. At its head was the inquisitor, usually a Dominican or Franciscan monk, possessing deep knowledge of theology and canon law. Under him were notaries, who recorded every word during interrogations, familiars, secular assistants who acted as spies and informants, and of course, executioners, who carried out the most terrible sentences. One of the key innovations of the Inquisition was the procedure of the inquisitorial process. Unlike ordinary judicial proceedings, where the accused was informed who was accusing them and of what, the Inquisition operated on the principle of secrecy. A person could be arrested based on an anonymous denunciation, not know the names of their accusers, or even the essence of the charges. This created an atmosphere of universal suspicion and fear. No one was safe from the possibility that neighbors or even relatives might secretly denounce them to the inquisitor. The case of the cloth merchant Pierre Autier from Toulouse is indicative. A complete record of his trial, dated 1304, has been preserved in the archives. Autier was arrested after a denunciation by his business partner with whom he had a dispute over profit sharing. The accusation of sympathy for the Cathars was fabricated, but the mechanism of the Inquisition had already been set in motion. For 6 months, Autier was held in prison, subjected to hours of interrogations, forced to list all acquaintances with whom he had ever discussed matters of faith. Ultimately, unable to withstand the pressure, he incriminated himself and 23 other people, most of whom he did not even know personally. By the 14th century, the Inquisition had evolved into a sprawling network of tribunals, covering most of Catholic Europe. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 by the royal couple Ferdinand and Isabella, became particularly infamous. Unlike the Papal Inquisition, It was under the direct control of the crown and was used as an instrument not only of religious but also of political struggle. The procedure of the inquisitorial court was a meticulously crafted system where every step was aimed at the psychological suppression of the accused. The interrogation protocols preserved in the Vatican Archives reveal to us the anatomy of fear, a mechanism that transformed even the most resilient into broken individuals ready to confess to anything. It all began with an arrest, which usually occurred at night. A person was torn from their familiar world without explanation. According to documents from 1560, from the archives of the Roman Inquisition, the arrested individual was not informed of the names of their accusers, nor the nature of the charges. This uncertainty became the first instrument of psychological pressure. Following the arrest was solitary confinement. 16th century Spanish Inquisition protocols described these cells as cramped, damp, devoid of light. Isolation could last for weeks or even months. During this time, the person, deprived of contact with the outside world, gradually lost their sense of reality. By the time of the first interrogation, the accused was already in a state of extreme psychological exhaustion. The inquisitors used a technique that today would be called cognitive dissonance. The interrogation protocol of the bookseller Giovanni Moroni from Modena, dated 1572, records a characteristic pattern. First, the inquisitor displayed benevolence, promising leniency in case of a sincere confession, and then abruptly changed his tone, threatening eternal torment not only in this life but also after death. If psychological pressure yielded no results, torture was employed. The archive documents contain detailed descriptions of these procedures, presented as legal actions. It is noteworthy that each torture was documented by a notary with meticulous accuracy. In the interrogation protocol of the apothecary Tommaso Crescentini from Florence, 1602, we read, "Moderate constriction of the limbs was applied to facilitate the establishment of truth." This euphemistic phrasing concealed the agonizing procedure of stretching the body on the rack. Legal formalities created an illusion of legitimacy. For instance, there was a rule that an inquisitor could not directly condemn someone to death. Instead, he would hand the accused over to the secular authorities, accompanying this with a hypocritical plea for mercy. This fiction allowed the Church to formally remain within the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." A particularly sophisticated method was the so-called leading question. Documents from 1636 from the archives of the Venetian Inquisition describe how the interrogator posed a question in such a way that it already contained the answer. "Is it not true that last Friday you denied the divine nature of Christ in conversation with your neighbor?" Denial was interpreted as obstinacy, and agreement as an admission of guilt. In the year 1633, a drama unfolded in the halls of the Vatican Palace, the consequences of which resonated throughout all of European science. 70-year-old Galileo Galilei, mathematician, physicist, astronomer, whose discoveries overturned the understanding of the universe, stood before the Inquisition court. The yellowed pages of the protocols, preserved in secret archives, reveal an astonishing story of the confrontation between scientific thought and religious dogma. The conflict began long before the trial. As early as 1616, Galileo received a warning from Cardinal Bellarmine about the inadmissibility of defending Copernicus's heliocentric system. The Church insisted on a literal interpretation of biblical texts, where the Earth was described as the immovable center of the universe. But Galileo, armed with a telescope of his own design, saw a different picture of the cosmos. Archival documents preserve Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina of Tuscany, where the scientist attempts to reconcile science and religion. The Holy Scripture cannot lie or err, but its interpreters can err. This bold attempt to delineate the spheres of influence of science and faith was perceived by church authorities as a challenge. Fatal for Galileo was his work, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, published in 1632. Although the book formally presented both systems, Ptolemy's geocentric and Copernicus's heliocentric, it became clear to any reader on whose side the author's sympathies lay. Particularly offensive to Pope Urban VIII was that the arguments in defense of geocentrism were put into the mouth of a character named Simplicio, a simpleton. The judicial proceedings, the details of which are revealed by the Vatican Archives, were carefully orchestrated. Galileo was not directly charged with heresy. This could have led to a death sentence. Instead, he was accused of disobedience to the church ban of 1616. The Inquisition's strategy was cunning. By confessing guilt for disobedience, Galileo indirectly acknowledged the erroneousness of his scientific views. The interrogation protocols reflect the scientist's internal struggle. Galileo tried to prove that in his dialogue, he did not assert the truth of heliocentrism, but merely presented it as a mathematical hypothesis. However, the inquisitors were unyielding. They needed not just physical submission, but also the intellectual surrender of the great scientist. On June 22, 1633, the final session took place in the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. According to preserved documents, the 70-year-old Galileo, kneeling in the white shirt of a penitent, pronounced his abjuration. I, Galileo Galilei, son of the late Vincenzo Galilei, Florentine, 70 years of age, personally before this court, and kneeling before you, most reverend cardinals, abjure, curse, and detest the error and heresy of the earth's motion. Legend has it that after his abjuration, Galileo whispered, "And yet it moves." Archival documents do not confirm this beautiful story, but it has become a symbol of the indestructibility of scientific truth. The consequences of the trial proved dire for both Galileo himself and for European science. The scientist was sentenced to house arrest, where he spent the last 8 years of his life. His works were placed on the Index of Forbidden Books, where they remained until 1835. Many researchers feared developing heliocentric ideas, which slowed the progress of astronomy. Behind the scenes of the high-profile Galileo trial lay a complex web of intrigues, personal ambitions, and political maneuvers. Secret documents discovered in the Vatican Archives reveal the true motives of those who sought to destroy the great scientist. These materials, inaccessible to researchers until the end of the 20th century, paint a completely different picture of events than that presented in the official Inquisition protocols. Particularly revealing is the correspondence between Cardinal Francesco Barberini, nephew of Pope Urban VIII, and the Dominican monk Niccolo Riccardi, the chief censor of the Vatican. In a letter dated February 27, 1632, Barberini writes, "His Holiness is extremely angered by the audacity of the Florentine mathematician." In the figure of Simplicio, many recognized the pontiff himself, which is an unheard-of insult to the throne of St. Peter. This testimony sheds light on the true reason for the Pope's anger. Not so much Galileo's scientific views as his wounded vanity. Urban VIII, born Maffeo Barberini, before his ascension to the papal throne, was considered a patron of the sciences and even maintained friendly relations with Galileo. However, personal offense turned him into an implacable enemy of the scientist. Another important document is the secret denunciation of the Jesuit Cristoforo Scheiner, a long-standing scientific opponent of Galileo. In a note addressed to Cardinal Inquisitor Desiderio Scalia, Scheiner states, Galileo not only propagates heretical views on the motion of the Earth, but also undermines the foundations of morality, encouraging young people to rely on their own observations instead of the authority of the Church. This note, dated November 1632, shows how scientific rivalry escalated into a personal vendetta. Scheiner and Galileo had argued for years about the nature of sunspots, and each claimed priority in their discovery. Now, Scheiner used the Inquisition as a tool to eliminate a competitor. Also noteworthy is the role of Cardinal Roberto Bellarmine, who, as early as 1616, issued a warning to Galileo. In his personal papers, discovered in the archive, there is a remarkable entry. The matter is not in the truth or falsity of Copernicus's teaching. The danger is that ordinary people, learning about the motion of the Earth, may doubt other truths taught by the Church. This entry reveals the true anxiety of the Church hierarchs, fear of the spread of critical thinking among the flock. The heliocentric system was dangerous not in itself, but as a symbol of intellectual independence that could undermine the authority of the Church in other matters. Particularly interesting are the documents related to the preparation of the trial itself. Letters between members of the special commission created to consider Galileo's case testify to the predetermined outcome. Cardinal Francesco Albizzi wrote in April 1633, "It is necessary to achieve a public recantation to teach a lesson to all who dare to place their conclusions above sacred texts."
February 17, 1600. The Campo dei Fiori in Rome is filled with a crowd. In the center is a pyre, and tied to a stake is a man in the white shirt of a penitent. This is Giordano Bruno, philosopher, poet, former monk, whose thought proved too daring for his time. The Inquisition documents, preserved in the Vatican Archives, allow us to reconstruct the tragic path of this remarkable man. Born in 1548 in the small town of Nola near Naples, Filippo Bruno, such was his secular name, entered the Dominican order at the age of 16, taking the monastic name Giordano. Even then, he was distinguished by an insatiable thirst for knowledge and independent thinking. In the monastery library, he devoured forbidden books, studying the works of ancient philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers. In the records of the first interrogations, dated 1592, Bruno recounts his escape from the monastery. This occurred in 1576, after which his long wanderings across Europe began. Bruno visited Geneva, Toulouse, Paris, London, Wittenberg, Prague, everywhere inspiring admiration in some and hatred in others. He taught, wrote, participated in disputations. His cosmological ideas, expounded in the treatises, quote, and two, radically contradicted official church doctrine. Unlike Copernicus, who merely placed the sun at the center of our planetary system, Bruno went much further. He asserted that the universe is infinite, that there are countless worlds similar to ours, and that they might be inhabited. He wrote, Bruno's decision to return to Italy in 1591 proved fatal. In Venice, he was arrested based on a denunciation by the nobleman Giovanni Mocenigo, in whose house the philosopher lived, teaching him the art of mnemonics. The text of the denunciation has been preserved in the archives. He said that Christ was a deceiver, that there is no Trinity in God, that the world is eternal, and there are countless worlds. After the Venetian prison, Bruno was transferred to Rome, where his agonizing 8-year trial began. The inquisitors presented him with 8 charges, including the denial of transubstantiation, the divinity of Christ, the doctrine of the plurality of worlds, and the infinity of the universe. The interrogation records show Bruno's astonishing steadfastness.
Not only did he not recant his views, but he also attempted to convince the inquisitors of their truth, appealing to logic and philosophy. In January 1600, after years of interrogations and admonishments, Bruno was given the final verdict: death by burning. He was offered a last chance at salvation: recantation. According to the record of Inquisitor Cardinal Bellarmine, Bruno replied, "I neither ought nor wish to recant. I have nothing to deny, and I see no reason for recantation." On February 17, 1600, the sentence was carried out. Before his execution, according to eyewitness accounts, Bruno was told that he was being burned out of love for his soul. To which the philosopher replied, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive it." In the 1990s, researchers discovered documents in the Vatican Archives shedding new light on the trial of Giordano Bruno. Among them were interrogation transcripts, which had remained inaccessible to scholars for centuries. These yellowed pages with faded ink became the voice of the philosopher, reaching us through the flames of the pyre in the Campo de' Fiori. Particularly striking are the records of the interrogation from June 7, 1598. The inquisitor, Cardinal Roberto Bellarmine, known for his erudition and sophisticated logic, attempts to trap Bruno. Bruno's reply, recorded by the notary, demonstrates the philosopher's brilliant mind. The inquisitors applied classic psychological pressure techniques to Bruno. First, he was placed in a solitary cell in the underground prison of Torre di Nona, where the prisoner lost track of days. Then followed hours-long interrogations, during which the inquisitors took turns, giving the accused no rest. The record from December 12, 1598, notes that the interrogation lasted 14 hours without interruption. One of the psychological tactics was a sharp shift from threats to promises of mercy. Cardinal Madruzzo, according to the records, told Bruno, but Bruno remained steadfast. The record from January 3, 1599, contains his reply. Bruno's philosophical arguments in defense of his cosmological ideas are particularly interesting. In one of the last interrogations he says, "If space is infinite, and to deny this is to deny the infinity of God, then why should we believe that the creative power of the Creator manifested itself only at one point in this infinity? This contradicts both reason and the idea of God's omnipotence." The inquisitors tried to attack Bruno from the standpoint of Aristotelian physics, which remained the official doctrine of the Church. They argued that the multiplicity of worlds was impossible because heavy elements tend towards a single center of the universe. Bruno's reply, recorded in the transcript, demonstrates his astonishing scientific intuition. This idea of the relativity of motion and gravity anticipated Newton's discoveries by 3/4 of a century. But the inquisitors were not interested in scientific truth, but in defending dogmas. When arguments ran out, they resorted to threats. Behind the dry statistics of the Inquisition lie thousands of human fates, nameless victims whose voices remained unheard for centuries. Vatican Archives have preserved documentary evidence of the scale of this tragedy in various parts of Europe. According to the registers of the Spanish Inquisition, from 1480 to 1820, approximately 150,000 people passed through its tribunals. Of these, about 5,000 were sentenced to the death penalty, while the rest were subjected to various forms of punishment, from public penance to imprisonment and confiscation of property. In Portugal, these figures amounted to about 40,000 trials and 2,000 executions. Italian tribunals heard no fewer than 70,000 cases, with approximately 1,200 death sentences. The French Inquisition, operating predominantly in the south of the country, conducted about 30,000 trials. However, historians note that these data are incomplete. Many documents were deliberately destroyed or lost over time. Behind every figure in this grim statistic lies a human tragedy. The archives preserve the case of Maria Gonzalez of Toledo, a simple peasant woman accused by her neighbors of secretly practicing Judaism in 1590. Interrogation protocols show that her only guilt was refusing to eat pork and observing the Sabbath, habits inherited from her grandmother. After 8 months of imprisonment and numerous interrogations, she was sentenced to confiscation of property and lifelong wearing of the San Benito, a shameful garment marking those condemned by the Inquisition. Her husband and 3 children were left without means of subsistence. The Venetian archives preserve the case of Antonio Brignole, a carpenter, accused in 1623 of possessing forbidden books. During a search of his workshop, a treatise on astronomy was found, mentioning the Copernican system. Despite the fact that Brignole could not read and kept the book only because of the beautiful illustrations of the starry sky, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison and public penance. Particularly tragic are the cases of midwives and healers accused of witchcraft. The archives of the German city of Bamberg preserve the protocols of the trial of Martha Kummer, a village midwife. In 1632, she was accused of casting a spell on her neighbor's cattle after a quarrel over non-payment for her services. Under torture, the woman confessed to communicating with the devil and was sentenced to be burned. In her case, there is a note from the inquisitor, a euphemism concealing cruel torture. Inquisition documents also reveal the social aspect of the persecutions. Most of the victims belonged to the lower strata of society: artisans, peasants, small traders. They had neither connections at court nor means to bribe witnesses or officials. Statistics show that representatives of the nobility accounted for less than 3% of the total number of accused. The geography of the persecutions is also noteworthy. In Spain, the main blow fell on the conversos, baptized Jews suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. In the German lands, witchcraft trials predominated. In Italy, intellectual heresies and free thinking were more often prosecuted. In France, for connections with Protestantism, these differences reflected not only religious but also political priorities of the authorities in different regions. The Inquisition left a deep mark on the collective memory of European peoples. The fear of a neighbor's denunciation, suspicion of unusual behavior, distrust of new ideas. All these social traumas were formed over centuries and passed down from generation to generation. Even after the official abolition of the inquisitorial tribunals, their methods and practices continued to influence public consciousness. In the history of the Inquisition, the persecution of women accused of witchcraft and sorcery holds a special place. Archival documents, recently uncovered by researchers, reveal a shocking picture of systematic gender-based discrimination, disguised as a fight against heresy. Statistics speak for themselves. Of all those accused of sorcery between the 15th and 17th centuries, approximately 80% were women. The infamous treatise Malleus Maleficarum, written by the Dominican monks Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger in 1486, played a decisive role in forming the theoretical basis for the persecution of witches. Recently discovered drafts of this work contain overtly misogynistic passages that did not make it into the final version. The authors asserted, "Woman is a chimera, but know that behind the beautiful face of a lion lies the tail of a venomous dragon." The archives of the Würzburg Inquisition preserve the case of Margareta Horber, accused of sorcery in 1628. The reason for suspicion was that, as a widow, she lived alone, gathered herbs, and assisted women in childbirth. In the interrogation transcript, the inquisitor asks, "How can you, woman, know the properties of herbs if you have not been taught? From where does this knowledge come, if not from the devil?" The question itself exposes the prejudice. A woman possessing knowledge was perceived as a threat to the established order. Elderly single women were particularly vulnerable. In the trial records from Salzburg, dating to the 1640s, a pattern emerges. Almost 70% of the accused were widows over 50 years old, often owning small properties. After execution, their property was confiscated in favor of the church or local authorities, creating an economic incentive for accusations. The methods of identifying witches reflected deeply entrenched gender prejudices. A recently discovered document in the Cologne archives titled "Guide to Identifying Servants of Satan" lists such signs of a witch: excessive beauty or ugliness, knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants, independent disposition, unwillingness to obey a husband or father. Particularly sophisticated was the procedure for searching for the witch's mark, a special sign allegedly left by the devil on the bodies of his servants. The woman was completely stripped, all body hair was shaved, and she was subjected to a humiliating examination in search of moles, scars, or any other marks. Inquisition records from Bamberg describe how special mark seekers pricked suspicious areas of the skin with needles. If the woman felt no pain or the spot did not bleed, it was considered proof of connection with evil forces. Torture applied to those accused of sorcery often had a sexualized character. Recently uncovered documents from the Trier archives contain descriptions of special methods applied exclusively to women. Inquisitors claimed that witches gained their power through intimate relations with demons, so interrogations were often accompanied by humiliating procedures aimed at finding evidence of such contacts. The mass hysteria of the witch hunt reached its peak in the small German town of Ellwangen, where over 400 women were executed between 1611 and 1618. Recently discovered archival documents show how accusations spread like an epidemic. Under torture, women named their accomplices, often pointing to neighbors or even relatives. It is noteworthy that during periods of social crises, epidemics, crop failures, wars, the number of witch trials sharply increased. Women became convenient scapegoats, on whom responsibility for natural disasters and social problems could be placed. In the Inquisition documents of Lorraine from 1630, it is directly stated, "The current plague and famine are the result of the machinations of witches, who have conspired with the devil against Christendom." The history of the Inquisition is full of blank spots and mysteries, many of which are related to the deliberate destruction of documents. The Vatican Archives, despite their impressiveness, hold only a fraction of the material that once existed. Many crucial pieces of evidence have been irrevocably lost, burned, washed away by water, or simply disappeared under mysterious circumstances. This loss of documents not only creates academic problems, but also fuels numerous conspiracy theories. The archives suffered particularly significant losses during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1798, when French troops entered Rome, a significant portion of the Inquisition's documents was transported to Paris. During transit, many materials were damaged or lost. After Napoleon's fall, only a part of the archives returned to the Vatican. By various estimates, between 20 and 40% of all documents were lost. But it wasn't only military actions that caused the disappearance of papers. Historians have found evidence of the deliberate destruction of compromising materials by the church authorities themselves. In the diary of Cardinal Consalvi, the Vatican's Secretary of State in the early 19th century, there is an entry. "By His Holiness's instruction, certain documents capable of casting a shadow on the Holy Church were removed from the archive and destroyed. This is a necessary measure to protect the authority of faith in these difficult times. The purging of archives was particularly active after the official abolition of the Inquisition. When liberal historians began to gain access to archival materials in the 19th century, church authorities realized what a blow the publication of a complete and unedited history of the Inquisition could deal to the reputation of Catholicism. Interestingly, not only documents related to the most brutal episodes were destroyed, but also materials revealing the political motives of the persecutions. Professor Carlo Ginzburg of the University of Bologna, one of the leading specialists in the history of the Inquisition, states, "Almost no documents have survived in the archives showing the connection between the economic interests of the Church and the persecution of heretics." Yet, the confiscation of property from the condemned was an important source of income. Gaps in the archival records have led to a genuine academic detective work to reconstruct lost data. Historians use indirect sources, private letters, diaries of witnesses, records from city chronicles, to reconstruct the picture of the Inquisition's activities in periods and regions for which official documents are missing. The question of the scale of the Inquisition's activities generates particularly sharp discussions. Conservative historians, often associated with the Catholic Church, argue that the number of victims was relatively small, and the Inquisition's methods were more humane than secular justice of the time. Liberal researchers, on the other hand, speak of hundreds of thousands of victims and the systematic nature of the repressions. Archives become a battlefield of ideologies. Historian Henry Kamen writes, "Of particular interest are the so-called documents whose existence is known from other sources but which have never been found. For example, the complete protocols of Giordano Bruno's trial. What is available to researchers today are only brief excerpts and the final verdict. Where the thousands of pages of transcripts from 8 years of interrogations are located is unknown." The 20th century marked a turning point for the secret archives of the Inquisition. For decades, historians and researchers waged a persistent struggle for access to documents capable of shedding light on the darker pages of European history. This struggle began long before the official opening of the archives. Already in the 19th century, individual scholars attempted to gain permission to work with Inquisition materials, but faced an insurmountable wall of ecclesiastical bureaucracy and secrecy. The situation only began to change after the Second World War, when a new generation of historians demanded a re-evaluation of the policy of secrecy. In 1957, Sorbonne professor Jacques Lefebvre published an open letter to Pope Pius XII, in which he wrote, "The concealment of historical documents under the pretext of protecting the Church's reputation contradicts the very spirit of scientific truth-seeking. We cannot understand the past if a significant part of it remains under lock and key." This appeal was supported by hundreds of scholars from various countries, creating unprecedented pressure on the Vatican. The first serious breakthrough occurred under Pope John XXIII, who, as part of the Church's renewal policy, allowed limited access to some Inquisition materials dated prior to the 18th century. This was a small but significant victory for the scientific community. However, the most sensitive documents, including the complete records of the trials of Galileo and Bruno, remained inaccessible. The real turning point came during the pontificate of John Paul II. In 1998, on the eve of the new millennium, a historic decision was made to open the archives of the Roman Inquisition to researchers. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, who then headed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the direct heir of the Inquisition, stated, "The Church is not afraid of historical truth. On the contrary, it needs it for the purification of memory." This decision was part of a broader policy of historical repentance pursued by John Paul II. In the same year, the Pope issued an unprecedented document, We Remember, a reflection on the Holocaust, in which he acknowledged the historical responsibility of Christians for anti-Semitism. And in 2000, an official apology followed for the sins of the Church in the past, including the persecution of heretics and scientists. However, the opening of the archives proved to be far from complete. Researchers immediately encountered numerous restrictions. Firstly, only professional historians with letters of recommendation from academic institutions were granted access. Secondly, the number of researchers simultaneously working in the archive was strictly limited. Thirdly, some categories of documents remained classified. Professor Adriano Prosperi of the University of Bologna, one of the first to gain access to the archives, recalls, "We were only allowed to work with certain collections. When I requested materials on witch trials in northern Italy, I was told that these documents were undergoing restoration. When I repeated the request a year later, it turned out that they had not yet been catalogued. It seemed as if the Church was still trying to control historical memory." Particularly sharp discussions were sparked by documents concerning the cooperation of the Inquisition with secular authorities. Historians discovered evidence that ecclesiastical tribunals were often used as an instrument of political struggle. The archives contained letters from kings and princes requesting investigations against their political opponents. These findings called into question the official position of the Church, according to which the Inquisition acted solely for religious reasons. In the 2000s, the discussion about access to the archives reached a new level, thanks to digital technologies. A group of international scholars launched an initiative to create a complete digital copy of the Inquisition archives, accessible online to researchers worldwide. This project, named Open Inquisition, provoked a mixed reaction from the Vatican. On the one hand, the Church recognized the importance of preserving historical documents in digital format. On the other hand, concerns were raised that an unprepared public might misinterpret historical materials out of context. In 2010, a compromise was reached. A gradual digitization of the archives began, with the publication of materials on a special scientific portal with necessary historical commentaries. However, full openness is still a long way off. According to historians, only about 60% of the surviving Inquisition documents are available to researchers. The rest are either still classified or are in such a physical state that it is impossible to work with them. The Vatican explains these restrictions by the need for thorough restoration and cataloging, but critics see this as a continuation of a policy of selective openness. Debates about the full disclosure of the archives continue today. Scholars point out that without access to the entire body of documents, it is impossible to form a complete picture of the Inquisition's activities and its influence on European history. In turn, the Church insists on a gradual and controlled process of opening the archives to ensure their preservation and correct interpretation. The shadows of the Inquisition continue to influence the modern world, even though its fires have long been extinguished. By studying the yellowed pages of archival documents, we discover not just evidence of past cruelty, but also unsettling parallels with the present. The mechanisms for suppressing free thought created by the Inquisition have proven surprisingly resilient, changing only in form but retaining their essence. The influence of the Inquisition on the development of European science cannot be overstated. After the trial of Galileo, an atmosphere of self-censorship reigned in scientific circles, persisting for decades. Scientists avoided conclusions that might contradict church dogma, even when they had convincing evidence. Science historian Alessandra Fiori, in her study The Shadow of the Pyre, cites a striking fact. After Galileo's trial, the number of scientific treatises on astronomy in Italy decreased by 70% and remained at that level for almost a century. Even deeper was the Inquisition's influence on public consciousness. Fear of denunciation, suspicion of unusual behavior, distrust of new ideas. These psychological traumas were formed over centuries and passed down from generation to generation. Even after the official abolition of inquisitorial tribunals, their methods and practices continued to influence social relations. In the 20th century, humanity encountered new forms of ideological control, remarkably reminiscent of inquisitorial practices. Totalitarian regimes created their own systems for identifying and punishing dissenters, using methods honed by the Inquisition: secret denunciations, public recantations, show trials. As philosopher Hannah Arendt notes, totalitarianism invented nothing new. It merely perfected the technologies of suppression known since the time of the Inquisition. Particularly disturbing parallels are found in the practice of public penitence and recantation. When, in the 1930s, defendants in Moscow trials confessed to incredible crimes, many historians noted the similarity of these confessions to self-incriminations in inquisitorial tribunals. The methods of psychological pressure developed by medieval inquisitors proved to be in demand in the modern era as well. Even in democratic societies, echoes of inquisitorial practices can be found. The phenomenon of cancel culture, where a person is ostracized for opinions that contradict the dominant ideology, largely resembles the social exclusion of heretics. The only difference is that the role of inquisitors is now played not by church hierarchs, but by an impersonal mass of social media users. And instead of the stake, there is professional and social isolation. The study of Inquisition archives has not only historical but also practical value for modern society. By analyzing the mechanisms for suppressing free thought, we gain a kind of vaccine against new forms of ideological control. Historian Carlo Ginzburg rightly remarks, "Knowledge of how the Inquisition worked helps us recognize its modern counterparts, even if they hide under the guise of protecting public morality or national security." Of particular importance is the study of the psychological mechanisms used by the Inquisition. How did they manage to make people confess to crimes they did not commit? How was an atmosphere of universal suspicion created? Why did neighbors denounce neighbors? The answers to these questions help us understand not only the past, but also the present. Today, when information technologies create unprecedented opportunities for controlling people's private lives and thoughts, the lessons of the Inquisition become especially relevant. Systems of mass surveillance, algorithms for behavioral analysis, facial recognition technologies. All of these can become tools of new total control if society does not learn from the past. The full disclosure of Inquisition archives is a necessary step to prevent the repetition of historical errors. As Pope Francis noted during the opening ceremony of new sections of the Vatican Archive in 2018, the Church is not afraid of history. On the contrary, she loves it and would like to love it more and better as she loves God. Therefore, I open these archives with the calm certainty that serious and objective historical research will be able to appreciate the bright moments of this history without ignoring the dark ones. The legacy of the Inquisition is ambiguous. On the one hand, these are tragic pages of history, filled with the suffering of innocent people. On the other hand, it is a lesson about how easily institutions created to protect certain values can turn into a machine for suppressing the human spirit. And this is a lesson we have no right to forget.